time for them then. Let me introduce then our next speaker. It is going to be Mr. William Murray, the chairman of the Religious Freedom Coalition, who will speak on the plight of the church in the Middle East. Mr. Murray.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by talking about the situation in Iraq, a situation that has just been truly ignored, not only by our media, but unfortunately by two administrations now. The George W. Bush administration was particularly bad on this issue. There's no other way to put it. There was, in a way, Christians in Iraq who became persecuted after the second Iraq War, the second Gulf War, were placed in horrendous situations of abuse and persecution. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out. 60% of the Iraqi Christian population was forced out of their original homes, some as internal refugees and others externally. The refugee crisis created the largest single urban refugee crisis ever in the world. We think of refugees with, we see the United Nations tents and this and that and the other thing. This is the reality. There are so many refugees, Christian refugees from Iraq, in Jordan and in Syria, that the only way to measure their presence was by the additional use of water. Is how the Jordanian government attempted to recognize this. You had situations where Iraqi Christian refugees were renting 1- and 2-bedroom apartments, and 4 or 5 families were living inside of those apartments. Most often the men were afraid to work at all, and it was left many times up to the young children to go up, because if the men were caught working, they were there illegally. The Jordanian government refused to give them refugee status. They called them our friends from Iraq. And because they were not classified as refugees, of course, the government was not required to give them the appropriate benefits that are normally bestowed on refugees in a country. In 2007, we did a fact-finding mission to Jordan and several other places on the issue of the Iraqi Christian refugees. And out at the table, there is a final report, and it says Iraqi Christian refugees in peril. Among those on this was a nationally known journalist and best-selling author by the name of Ken Timmerman. Also the former governor of South Carolina, Governor David Beasley, myself, and an Anglican priest by the name of Keith Roderick. What we found was appalling. We found out that at the American embassy in Amman, that there were Jordanian hired guards. Whenever an Iraqi Christian refugee approached the embassy, they were told basically by those guards, your situation is no concern to the Americans, you go to the United Nations. The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. We arranged a meeting. Fortunately, we had a former governor with us. It wasn't too difficult to arrange a meeting with Ambassador Hale. We were stunned. One of the most stunning things is when he wanted a photograph of all of us in front of a rainbow-colored flag, but that's another issue. But Mr. Hale, Ambassador Hale, had never, to this point, ever talked to any Christian refugee organization. They had never been in a church, and when we brought up the issue, one of his staff piped up, it isn't our job to go to church. We found out in our interviews with the Iraqi Christian refugees that the overwhelming majority, perhaps as many as 90%, had relatives in the United States. but they were never told that they had the ability to fill out the necessary forms or to contact those relatives in the United States in order to assist them to come to the United States. Now, subsequent to our visit and complaints filed with the State Department and Governor Beasley contacting individuals directly in the White House, some of that changed. But this just goes to prove the point that the United States, which actually caused the greatest urban refugee crisis ever, did absolutely nothing in order to heal the situation. And in fact, refugee status to Muslim refugees who had left Iraq, they were given preferential treatment to the Christian refugees by the United Nations Commission, High Commissioner on Refugees, simply by the fact that that office was entirely staffed by Muslims. They were the ones, the United Nations, that picked the refugees that were then sent to the United States Embassy after they had passed and secured this, and here is the problem. 60% of the refugees to 70% of the refugees were Christian. Yet it was 67 or 80 to 70 to 80% of those who received refugee status to the United States were Muslims. Does that make any sense to anyone? A part of this was an effort by the Bush administration to prove that we were, quote, not crusaders, and to prove in some ideological manner that I still have yet to been able to figure out that this treatment of the Christian refugees somehow proved that we weren't there fighting a war against Muslims, that we were there trying to free Muslims. Oddly enough, when we arrived, Iraq was a secular nation where Christians had freedom. By the time we were through with our war, Iraq was an Islamic republic under which the Constitution states very, very clearly that yes, people have equal rights as long as that does not conflict with Sharia law, which is a oxymoron, of course. So that is the situation in Iraq. It is extremely bleak. It is still bad. Condoleezza Rice was so bad on this issue that when we learned that Hillary Clinton was going to become the next Secretary of State, many of us who have fought over this battle for years, including myself, a congressman that's well known to you, wrote letters to congratulations to her, and because we felt that the situation under Hillary Clinton could only improve, it was so bad under Condoleezza Rice. Boy, were we surprised. The first thing that Hillary Clinton did when she got into office was to travel to the Middle East to sell bonds to the Saudis, and said, don't worry, we won't mention human rights if you just keep buying our bonds. And then she flew to China and basically said the same thing to the Chinese. So rather than being a Secretary of State, she's become the chief bond salesman for the United States of America. The difficulty is that the United States is a debtor nation. And I hate to get into internal American politics, but I think we have to be honest about this. We are a debtor nation. And the Bible clearly tells us and states to us that the debtor is the slave of the lender, and we are. We get most of our money to finance the functioning of the United States of America from individuals and nations who are the greatest human rights offenders in the world. We pretend that a lot of the money doesn't come from Saudi Arabia officially, but the reality is it comes from the Saudi royal families who buy our bonds through hedge funds. And although we show that half of our debt is financed internally in the United States, I seriously doubt that, and so do any real economists who understand the amount of money that goes through the hedge funds, the Saudi money that goes through the hedge funds. We basically cannot look at the people who are financing our government and tell them, you have to improve your human rights record. And that basically are the wealthy nations in the Middle East and China. As a result of that, we keep quiet about a lot of things. I have here, and I only have about 10 copies for those that want it. These are the known Islamic terror attacks against Christians since 9/11. Now this comes from a website that also keeps track of all terrorist attacks since 9/11. I think there have been 28,000 Islamic terror attacks with 44,000 killed. Those are innocent civilians. That has nothing to do with attacks on our troops or anything else. And I look back at this, and I was going to talk about the Middle East, but the reality is this isn't the situation with the Middle East. Going back to January, Egypt, 7 killed, 10 injured, 6, the worshippers, a guard gunned down one of the Muslim radicals who invaded the church and killed. Nigeria, Jos, January 17th, 48 killed, 96 injured, Muslim youth go on a rampage, hacking to death, 48 Christians to death after an attack on their church. Somalia in January, 19 dead, 30 wounded. Women and children are among 19 killed when an Islamist launched multiple assaults on apostates. February 5th, I'm skipping a lot of these where only 1 or 2 are killed. Karachi, Pakistan, 33 killed, 80 wounded. A Christian family and dozens of Shiites blown up by a bomb that was intended for Christians. Bangladesh, on February 20th, 8 people killed, 200 wounded when Muslim villagers riot against Christians and Buddhists. Philippines, February 27th, 15 women and 5 children killed, ages 1 to 5, gunned down by Moro Islamists sweeping through a Christian village. Nigeria, March 7th, 528 killed, 600 injured. When Muslims attack a town in the middle of the night, hacking people to death with machetes. The problem that we have is that this isn't reported. I could go on through some time here, but the problem is that these attacks are not just occurring within the Middle East. What has happened is that the attacks on 9/11 in the United States have emboldened the Islamic Jihad. It has become a trophy that Islamic jihadists want to outdo each other in order to see how many people that they can kill in the name of jihad as they hold up as their standard the attack on 9/11. And by the way, I'm glad the mosque was brought up at Ground Zero, because I thought I was the only one who was using the term. I pronounce it Gazwa, but I guess it's Gazwa, right? Gazwa. And it is my interpretation that the mosque is actually a rabat.
That's correct.
Yes, I'm right. Because a rabat is traditionally built when you invade an infidel territory, and this has been done all over the world, including in the nations that I'm talking about. As you get to a certain point in the invasion, you build a rabat, and that rabat is a place that the warriors, as they continue to go further into infidel territory and kill and maim and terrorize, they can come back to the rabat for rest and recreation. What we need is an awareness in our government, and we need an awareness in our press, and we need our government to set aside the fact that it is basically a debtor nation and to hold up the banner of human rights once again. Thank you.